Today, Gary Stevenson has released a documentary with Channel 4. It's called How to Get Filthy Rich, a documentary about inequality and taxing the rich. Stevenson rose to prominence after becoming a city trader and realizing that inequality is not only harming communities, but the economy too. He has now turned into an inequality activist and creates content on YouTube, Gary's Economics. Let's take a look at a clip of the documentary.
How many houses do you own?
24. But that's that's not the point.
My proposal is a wealth tax of 2% on wealth above £10 million. That would mean that if you're worth 35, 40 million pounds, you would have to pay a fair bit more. You know, you'd be looking at paying 2% on 30 million, so £600,000 a year. How do you feel about that?
Well, not very good, do I? Apart from the fact, I think the economics is... Because if you start taxing more people, the values which you're basing your figures on will collapse.
So let's just imagine in the future, you know, your nightmare comes true and I managed to get my wealth tax into law, and suddenly very, very wealthy people such as yourself do have to pay significantly more. How bad would that actually be for you and your family?
It would be disastrous, obviously. But so we would probably end up borrowing the money to pay the taxes, knowing that your government would doom to perdition. Sorry, Gary, your life at the top would be very limited.
Okay, thank you.
But we would work out a way to win through, as we've won through over the last
1,000 years.
Yeah,
well,
we fight to win.
I think the rest of the country should probably try to do that as well.
What a clip. I think that clip really spoke well to what Helena said earlier about, you know, older people owning the assets, want to protect it. Of course, the difference here, though, is that most older people are not in this man's position. This guy owns 24 houses. It's also very, very funny how those who are wealthy, those who have assets to protect, they say stuff like, oh, well, taxes on the rich, that's bad for the economy. That's silly economics. It's like, it's not silly economics. It's that you are protecting things that you have. You have a perspective on the economy, not through a rational lens or even an academic lens. You have it from a bias of protecting your own interests. It's as simple as that. But when you speak out against inequality and discuss taxing the rich, it upsets people. Entrepreneur and public speaker Dominic McGregor said this. This guy, in regards to Gary Stevenson, is seriously dangerous. No one steals wealth. It isn't a zero-sum game. The change in government GDP over time has been caused by overspending, not undertaxing. This year, government will take record tax revenue. Don't be fooled. Daniel Priestley, another entrepreneur who debated Gary on the Diary of a CEO podcast, tweeted, Gary's theory is that the cause of wealth inequality is wealth inequality. In his Oxford thesis, he claims that wealthy people become rich, buy assets, and then use their passive income to buy more and more assets. He also claims that the rich don't pay taxes like the rest of us. If his theory was correct and the UK was experiencing a wealth inequality crisis, the share of the wealth held by the top 1% would be rising. It's not. It's been stable for decades. The two reasons we are seeing issues at the bottom of the economic pyramid is because of technology and low-skilled migration. The cost of housing has also risen. It's not because a tiny group of elites buy up houses. It's because the government had a decade of low interest rates and stimulus, and an aging population don't want to sell their homes and pay stamp duty on a smaller place. We actually have over 9 million homes with 2+ spare rooms. Rich people are not interested in owning a 38R terraced home in the Midlands. It's easy to blame the rich for the problems we see, but the truth is hard to hear. The UK is only surviving because we still have about 3 million high earners who are paying historically high taxes. Actually, just 300,000 people, one in 100, are paying a third of the taxes, and 30,000 of them, 1 in 1,000, are paying 10% of the tax bill. In a country with 70 million people, a few football stadiums of hard-working, responsible, enterprising people are paying disproportionate taxes, and demonize them isn't helpful or based on any accurate data. Now, Priestley claims the share of the wealth has been stable for decades. The World the World Inequality Database and the Equality Trust report that the wealth share held by the top 0.1% in the UK doubled between 1984 and 2013, rising to 9% of total wealth. Today, the 50 wealthiest families in the country own more wealth than the combined assets of 34.1 million people. Priestley's stable claim relies on a narrow measure of wealth inequality. The Resolution Foundation says this is misleading because it hides a growing gap between generations and a huge rise in overall wealth inequality. UK household wealth reached 630% of GDP in 2024, up from 300% in the 1980s and 410% in 1997, driven mainly by rising asset prices rather than wages or savings. Priestley then says that the top 1% are paid 29 to 30% of all UK income tax. And this is what many people do when they defend the rich. They talk about income tax, which is fairly progressive, or not that progressive, but we have a progressive taxation system. It needs to be vastly improved. But it's on wealth they don't pay their fair share. Okay? Currently, capital gains is taxed less than income. You're being taxed on your work more than your passive income. You know, Reem Ibrahim does this a lot. I mean, I debated her and I said we need a wealth tax. And she was like, but rich people pay so much income tax. You're talking about income. I'm talking about wealth. Two very different things. In Priestley's original tweet, he said that, well, it's government regulation and their interference in the economy is why people can't get housing. But then he admits there's loads of empty homes. So there is wealth hoarding happening. The number one venture in this company, the number one commercial business in this country, okay, is landlordism. The number one thing. So we don't produce anything in this country, right? We don't provide any social capital or social utility. The number one thing is landlordism. There is a correlation between that. Now, this exchange between Daniel Priestley and Grok was really funny. So, responded to Priestley's tweets, Lance Lachlan, I believe that's his name, Lachlan says, what percentage of all UK wealth does the top 20% of people own? The answer is approximately 70% of all household wealth. A single breakdown is the top 1%, minus 21%, top 5%, 43%, top 10%, 56%, top 20%, sorry, top 20%, 70%, top 50, 90%, bottom 50, 10%. So if the UK had £100 of total wealth, the top 20% would own about £70, the bottom 80% would own about £30, bottom 50% would own only about £10. Priestley then replied with a prompt to Grok. Grok, is there any economy currently or in history where the bottom 50% of people in the economy has greater than 50% of the total wealth? And he got a reply, yes, Slovakia currently has the bottom 50% holding 17% of total household wealth, highest in recent EU data per Eurofund. Most countries are between 4 and 10%. The UK is between 9 and 10%. The global average is 2%. That's not good. In modern economies, this level is rare but possible with high ownership and lower asset concentration. Historical market economies rarely exceed low double digits for the bottom half. Slovakia have a more equal economy because of higher ownership of housing and to a lack of asset holding. Almost as if Gary is exactly right. The wealthier are using their capital to make more capital. 1 point for Gary and 1 point for Marx. Helena, what is Daniel Priestley on about?
I mean, he's trying to deflect, as always, away from the reality, of course, which is that if people did start to implement wealth taxes, him and his mates would end up having to pay higher rates of tax, and they just hate that. They are fundamentally opposed to it, so they will invent any chop logic to justify why things that would justify a wealth tax would be either wrong or bad, and then they find out that they are wrong. Now, one thing I will agree with him on is when it comes to housing, it is not just the over financialization of housing that makes it unaffordable. The points that he makes about low housing use efficiency in terms of spare bedrooms, the way in which that we have had kind of low interest rates and constrained supply has kept prices high, and that has incentivized people to move money into these assets to increase the value of these things, and stamp duty makes it harder to be able to move around to use housing efficiently. These things are all true, and they're also part and parcel of a privatized housing market, right? Like, none of these things would be an issue if we just kept these all as council housing. You know, if we had mass council housing in this country, or we had mass housing ownership like the post-Soviet countries have, where houses were already owned by people. They weren't part of the fire sell-off of the state that happened during the shock doctrine era of the neoliberalization of the post-Soviet states. Therefore, these people still have at least some amount of physical wealth owned by families in those countries, and they get passed down to the generations. You know, like, that is a way in which that you can help people to maintain some level of wealth, is if you keep these things owned by families or owned by the state. One of the points that Gary makes over and over again in his book, in his videos, in his documentaries, and whatever it is in his interviews, is that it's not just personal wealth that has massively declined in this country. It is state wealth that's massively declined in this country too, because we sold it all off to rich people who then use that to be able to increase their asset value to be able to become richer and richer oligarchs, right? So they will always do these kind of things. They will deflect to certain things that are part and parcel of a failed system, or they will lie and try and tell you that the rich pay lots of tax. Spoiler alert, the 10 wealthiest people in this country and the 10 highest taxpayers in this country, none of these people are the same. There are lots of high earners who pay a lot of tax, right? And, you know, if we did tax high earners more, maybe there'll be a chance they might move to Australia or something, right? The wealthy, we do not tax them a fucking bit. We do not tax the wealthy at all. That is why none of the 10 wealthiest people appear on the list of the 10 highest taxpayers, because they don't pay enough fucking tax, because they sit on their assets and generate passive income and passive revenue, or use them as collateral to be able to get loans that get taxed differently, whereas high earners just get high salaries and pay high levels of tax, right? These are two different things. It's a really easy way of these people being able to dodge the fact that we live in an oligarchy, which is what happens when so many too few people own too much of this country. That's why I get angry when people talk about, like, we need to cut welfare to fund defence, and I'm just like, if we're going to fund defence, something I would also take umbrage with, how about the people who own the fucking country should pay to defend this stuff, right? Like, why should I have to pay to defend a bunch of buildings and a bunch of assets owned by massive international private equity firms, billionaires, aristocrats, and the monarchy? I don't own any of this stuff. Why am I paying to protect it? I don't get any of that, right? But the reality, of course, is that the wealthy do own all the assets. They have been hoarding all of the assets. And the best way of having a broad base is to have these assets owned by as many people as possible. So that means state housing provision. It means increased access to home ownership and blocking institutional buyers and landlords from hoarding housing that they don't need to rent it back to be able to get a return without doing any work. And it also means more cooperative ownership of the businesses of this country, and the wealth that is generated being kept in the hands of the people who generated it, rather than the hands of the people who own the wealth in the first place.
Like, in the market economy, that can improve this, right? Like, I'm not against saying, oh, we need to build more houses. Absolutely true. But I think it's fundamentally down to the fact that it's ownership, right? We cannot get out of the housing crisis if we don't build council houses. Because, as I was pointing to before, the number one commercial business in this country is landlordism. And yes, we can build more and more houses, but it doesn't necessarily mean it goes to people. Now, of course, people bring in that. We've had this on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, the supply and demand economics, right? And us leftists get accused of not understanding basic economics of supply and demand. Sure, but when you increase the supply, sometimes it just goes to people's portfolios and it doesn't trickle down to the rest of us. So you do need also a state-owned sort of company. I mean, we do have Homes UK, it's not really utilised, but we need council houses and community wealth building. That's really important. Second thing about Gary Stevenson is absolutely true. Like, the state is poorer. Like, it's not just about, like, cash transfer from the top to the bottom. It's about public services. It's about the actual wealth. Like, the National Health Service is one of the biggest resources of wealth for working class people, because it's free at the point of use. So if we want strong public services and a strong state, we've got to tax the rich. We've got to tax the wealthy, because they just keep getting away with it, and they do accumulate their wealth. About supply and demand, again, I really love this because it's been coming up on Twitter. Like, I've come across anarcho-capitalists a lot on Twitter recently. Really didn't think I would. And they seem to think that us leftists don't understand the economy because we don't buy into supply and demand. Supply and demand is like it's a feature of a market economy. But I think that's like theory brain when you apply supply and demand to everything and it assumes it's going to work out that way. You know, inelastic pricing, for example. Yes, you can purchase a game for $70 or 70 quid these days. If a games company says we're going to sell a game for £1,000, that's elastic pricing because no one's going to spend £1,000 on the game, right? So they have to bring in the cost. When it comes to healthcare, and I would argue housing and rents, they can charge with whatever you want because you can't just move. Like when it comes to renting, someone might say, well, if the rent's too high, just choose somewhere else. But you've got to work in the local area, so therefore you've got to be nearby. The value of the place is down to the surrounding area. Like there's so many different factors, which means it's not highly liquid to choose between different properties. And that's where supply and demand falls flat. But people like Daniel Priestley, people like the Tom Harwood and the IEA would say, no, it's just supply and demand economics, and that's it.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
it.
And there are other types of goods as well that just don't follow the supply demand curves. There are Veblen goods and Giffen goods, things that where demand increases makes the price increase because of the level of prestige of the product itself, right? Like that's a thing that can happen with certain types of things in the economy. Sorry, the demand, so the price goes up as the demand, so the demand increases as the price goes up. Sorry, I got that the wrong way around. And other things that change prices in other ways that don't agree with the supply demand curve. These are all things that happen all the time. And as you say, right, they believe in the economics as if it's all happening in a frictionless sphere with no society around it. And I'm like, there are negative externalities in treating these things just as commodity markets rather than decommodifying them or trying to regulate them to create just the socially best outcomes. Like there is a centre of the ideology of Austrian economics, which is that if the market clears, if supply and demand is matched onto perfectly, then that is an end in as of itself, because it maximizes some kind of Pareto efficiency within the market. And I'm just like, does it create peak social utility? If we're getting all of this growth and it's going into the pocket of Elon Musk, is that a good society? Did we do a good thing there? I mean, well, that's for sociologists and for philosophers to work out, not for economists to work out. Economists can work out how to maximize efficiency all they want, right? Maybe that, in some cases, free markets, maybe it's nationalization, maybe it's certain other kinds of regulated markets. And loads of economists will be able to sort these things out between them, right? Like, I'm not going to try and claim to know everything about the truth about what things should be and shouldn't be privatized or decommodified or whatever. I'm going to get into the argument now. But the argument about whether the ends are social goods in as of themselves is not a problem that an economist can solve. That is for politicians, philosophers, and sociologists to solve. That is, as far as I'm concerned, what's important here. I want to make one last point too, and to respond to Daniel Priestley as well. And he said the problems at the bottom of the income distribution come from technology and from the problems of low-skilled immigration. Well, first of all, you can always skill people up. Like the idea that low-skilled immigration is like worse than new young people who don't have an education or don't have skills coming into the workforce. Well, these are the same problems. I don't buy these arguments for a moment. Anyway, like existing workforces can go into supervisory roles of low-skilled migration anyway. They get trained up. That's what's been shown by the data. There's kind of a wash. The reality, of course, is that the reason why there's certain things happening at the bottom of the income threshold is because of a lack of unionization. It's because of international free trade undermining the bargaining power of workers. It comes from jobs not providing the same return to labour that they did when we had a more equitably distributed economy from the 1945 to 1979 era than we have today. You know, you look at countries with social democracies, with trade union bargaining rights, with sectoral bargaining, with some kind of deal between capital and labour, they get better labour returns than we do. We are living in a world in which capital returns are significantly times higher than labour returns are, than they ever have been in the history of capitalism, right? Like, the labour return is much lower than it's ever been, and the way you fix that is by fixing that labour return, pre-distributing it towards working people, rather than just taxing it away from rich people. But it's worth pointing out, now the rich people have all of that wealth, the only way of getting back to an equitable distribution is through taxation. So until we find that fix where we can rebalance the returns for capital and labour, wealth taxes will indeed be necessary, as will land value taxes, as will capital gains taxes.
Big fan of LVT, land value tax. We can break the labour capital divide by common ownership, i.e. socialism. I know Marx is sat right there. We're going to go to our comments, but quickly what to say is people like Daniel Priestley, they don't care about inequality. They don't want to solve inequality. So they'll say, you can't do this, you can't do that. Not because they think it's a bad idea, it's because they don't want to solve inequality. Because part of Daniel Priestley's enterprise is to sell your dream. It's to sell you the idea that you need this, need that, and that's how you work hard. Listen to my product. That's a business in of itself. So he's predicated on inequality. No one's going to buy his stuff to say you need to get rich when people are having a decent life. So he doesn't want to solve inequality because that's his literal business.
And it's his moral ideology as well. He doesn't believe that inequality is a bad thing. Because again, like, conservatives go from these kind of base principles, virtue ethics about what taxation means and what moral hazard is. And I'm like, well, does it lead to social utility? Like, is it socially deleterious or not? And every single study shows that wild inequality is socially deleterious. Like, we know from the spirit level, we know from all the studies that have been done, that highly equal societies are worse societies. The happiest societies, the most productive societies, even some of the richest societies in this world, like you look at the Nordic countries, are some of the most equal societies, right? Like, the idea that somehow inequality is necessary for innovation, it's necessary for growth, it's necessary for prosperity is absolute fucking bullshit. It's total bullshit, and the real world examples show this. And Daniel Priestley knows this. He knows this because he quoted Denmark as one of his countries that has done really well out of capitalism because they ranked highly on the Economic Freedom Index. Yep, incredibly high taxes, lots of common ownership, and I'm like, well, turns out taxes are actually a good thing, eh, Daniel?